Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. For nearly a decade now, I've really been focused on the potential implications of technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence. And I've really come around to the view that we could well be on the leading edge of a very significant disruption. And I think it's a disruption that is going to completely redefine the way businesses compete. And it also could end up putting a terrific amount of stress both on our society and on our economy. And this is going to be true for virtually every country in the world. Now, the particular issue that I've really been focused on is the fact that in the future, smart algorithms, robots, machines in general are increasingly going to substitute for human workers. They're going to take over more and more of the work that's now being done by people, and I think that ultimately that could lead to some very significant challenges for us. Now, as I've been focused on this issue, I've had a chance to talk to a lot of the people that are really on the leading edge of these technologies, the people driving innovation in robotics and AI. And what I've found is that at least among that technical group of people, there is kind of an emerging consensus that maybe we really are headed for a big disruption, or maybe even we're poised to enter an entirely new era, a time when perhaps things are going to operate according to different rules than what we've seen historically. On the other hand, there's a lot of skepticism out there about this whole idea that maybe this time is really different and there's something really unique and different going on this time. And I think that it's probably fair to say that economists as a group tend to be quite skeptical of this idea that, something really extraordinary is happening with technology this time around. And the skepticism is largely based on the historical record. It turns out that this concern or fear that machines might displace a lot of workers and maybe lead to unemployment, it goes back at least 200 years ago to the Luddite revolts that happened in England. And since then, this issue has come up again and again. I'm sure that most of you have probably never heard of the Triple Revolution report, but this was actually a very prominent report. It was written by a brilliant group of people. It actually included 2 Nobel laureates. And this report was presented to the President of the United States. And the report said that if the US didn't take action right away, the whole country was going to be thrown into social and economic upheaval because millions and millions of people were going to be put out of work by industrial automation. Now, that report was given to President Lyndon Johnson in March of 1964. So that's over 50 years ago that this warning was given, and of course it hasn't really happened. What has happened is that things have adjusted, right? People have found new kinds of work, the economy has adjusted, so things have, in the long run at least, worked out. And that's always been the story so far. So I think it's very reasonable to be skeptical about the whole idea that this time something different is going to happen. But I really do think that we are now at a point where finally the technology is arriving and we really might expect something quite different to happen. So what I want to do is begin by showing you just one number that I think is at least indicative that something really interesting is happening here. If you go back to 1998, in the business sector of the U.S. economy, there were a total of 194 billion hours of labor performed. That's as measured by the government agency that measures those things. Now, if you go forward 15 years to the year 2013, the output of the business sector increased by over 40%, or by about $3.5 trillion. And during that same 15-year period, the US population grew by 40 million people. Okay, so that's really a lot of people. That's about 4 times the population of the Czech Republic. So over that 15 years, we basically added, your country times 4 to the US population. But still, we get to the year 2013, and it turns out that the amount of labor that was required by the business sector was exactly the same, despite all those new people that entered the population and that massive increase in output. So I think that's fairly remarkable, and I think that what it suggests is that businesses in the United States are increasingly relying on what we would call digital leverage. They are using this powerful information technology to produce ever more output, but they're doing it in a less labor-intensive way. They're really relying on fewer people. So I think that as that accelerates and becomes a bigger and bigger issue, that could potentially lead to a real problem for us. Now, given that I'm arguing that maybe this time is really different and that today's technology is quite different, I think it's important to sort of specify what exactly is so different about today's information technology relative to what we've seen in the past in terms of technological disruptions. And I would point to three basic things. The first thing, of course, is that we have had this ongoing process of exponential acceleration. You know, things have been accelerating. I think everyone has heard of Moore's Law, this sort of rule of thumb that says roughly every 2 years, computers double in power. But actually, it's much more broad-based than that. It extends, for example, to communications bandwidth and to memory capacity. In many cases, it extends to software, where we've seen an acceleration that goes even beyond what Moore's Law would imply for the hardware. But the really important thing to understand is that this process of exponential acceleration has now been going on for a long time. It's been going on for decades. If you measure from the late 1950s or so, which is when the very first integrated circuits were fabricated, we've seen something on the order of perhaps 30 doublings in computing power since that time. And that's just an extraordinary number of times to take any quantity and double it. And what it means is that we're now at a point where things are just moving at an astonishing rate, at a very, very rapid absolute rate. And the reason is that we've had this accumulated acceleration going on for so long. So what that implies for the future as we look ahead to the coming years, and especially to the coming decades, is that we're very likely to see things that astonish us. You know, in the next couple of decades, we're going to see things that really amaze us in terms of what these technologies can do, and the reason is that things are now moving so fast. And of course, things are going to continue to accelerate from this point on, so that really points to some dramatic changes coming in the relatively near future. The other really critical thing that I think is crucial is that the machines are, in a limited way, beginning to think. You know, they're taking on true cognitive capability. And by this, I don't mean science fiction, artificial intelligence like you see in movies. I don't mean robots running around and acting like people, or machines that can really think like human beings. What I do mean, though, is that machines and algorithms are increasingly making decisions. They're solving problems, and most importantly, they're learning. In fact, if there is one technology that is really central to this and is really becoming the driving force behind all of this, it is machine learning. This idea that a smart algorithm can churn through massive amounts of data, and based on that data, it can learn. It can figure out things. It can learn how to do new things. And you know, machine learning is just becoming an extraordinary, broad-based, powerful, disruptive technology. One of the best demonstrations of that we've seen recently is what Google's DeepMind division in London did with its AlphaGo system. This is the system that won at the ancient game of Go. Now, as you may know, Go is a very, a game that goes way back in history. It's very popular in Asia. But one of the things that really stands out about the game is that it's extraordinarily complex. It's much more sophisticated, for example, than chess. As you're playing the game of Go, the number of possible configurations that the board can be in is almost infinite. There are actually more possibilities than there are atoms in the universe. So what that means is that you can never build a computer that learns to win at the game of Go in the same way that chess was approached, which is just to build a very powerful brute force algorithm and then throw computational power at it and have it look ahead and optimize, by looking ahead many moves in advance. You can't do that with the game of Go because the game is just too complicated. The other thing that really stands out about the game to me is that if you talk to one of the very best Go players in the world, they very often cannot even explain to you exactly what they're thinking as they play the game. They'll often describe it just as a kind of feeling they get that they should make a particular move. So put yourself in the position of a computer programmer and imagine that you're talking to one of these Go players and you're trying to understand what they're doing so that you can somehow put that into computer code. You wouldn't even know where to begin. They can't even put into words what it is they're doing. So given those two qualities, the complexity of the game and the difficulty of articulating exactly how to play the game, it would seem to me that playing the game of Go at a world championship level, being one of the very best players in the world, should be a job or a task that's safe from automation. You know, this should be one of those things that only human beings do, and computers can't do this. But in fact, Google was able to build a system that not only taught itself to play the game of Go, but then rapidly became superhuman. It can now beat any human being on the planet. So that should really, I think, be kind of a cautionary flag for us. I mean, it suggests that a lot of our assumptions about what kinds of jobs can be impacted by technology, what can computers and robots do, a lot of these assumptions are probably going to turn out to be wrong. They're going to be challenged because the technology could well outperform. But I think at a minimum what it implies is that nearly any kind of job that's on some level routine and repetitive and predictable, if you come to work and you do the same kinds of things again and again, that job is very likely at some point to be threatened by automation. It doesn't matter if that job is in a factory or a warehouse or an office or a doctor's office for that matter. You know, all those jobs are going to be susceptible. So it is something that could potentially be very, very disruptive. The third thing that's really critical is that information technology and increasingly artificial intelligence is turning into a true general purpose technology. What I mean by this is simply that it's going to be everywhere. It's going to scale across everything. Many people have compared information technology to electricity. And you know, you would never ask what industries are most dependent on electricity or what jobs are most impacted by electricity. I mean, everything relies on electricity. And the same is going to be true of artificial intelligence. Everything ultimately will come to rely on it. It's going to be like a utility that will essentially underlie and scale across everything. So that's going to be just enormously disruptive across the entire economy. It's going to impact every sector, every industry, every employment area. So I do think it's going to be remarkably disruptive. And that's quite different from some of the disruptions that we've seen in the past. For example, you can think in terms of what happened in agriculture. Now, it used to be in countries like the US, or certainly here in the Czech Republic as well. At one time, if you go back far enough, most people worked on the land as, you know, in agriculture, producing food. Now, the number of people working in agriculture is tiny. It's maybe 1 or 2% of the workforce. And that, of course, is because of agricultural technology, tractors and combines and all the rest of it. But that was a very specific technology which impacted agriculture, and millions of jobs were lost, certainly, but then those people moved on to other sectors. They moved on to manufacturing, and then they moved on to the service sector. So it was kind of a one sector at a time impact. But that's quite different from what we see this time. With information technology, it's going to be like a utility that scales across everything. So it's going to be the whole economy, every industry, every sector, more or less simultaneously. So that's one of the reasons that I think we could potentially be looking at a much bigger disruption this time. Now, one of the things that people will point out if they're skeptical of this and they really don't believe that a lot of jobs could disappear, they'll point out that there is an ongoing process of what we might call creative destruction. In other words, sure, a lot of industries that exist today might be destroyed, but also a lot of new things are going to be created. You know, things like nanotechnology, virtual reality, synthetic biology. These are all going to be new industries that are going to be more important in the future, and of course, they'll have to hire people. And that's true, but what I'm showing here is that while these new areas of work are certainly going to exist, they might not be very labor intensive. You know, there just might not be that many jobs. And what you see here is a comparison of two industries. General Motors, as an example of a very traditional industry, GM at its peak employment had 840,000 workers. Now compare that to Google in 2012, and after adjusting for inflation, Google actually earned 20% more than General Motors ever did, but it did it with just a tiny fraction of the number of workers. It did it with less than 5% of the workers that General Motors employed. And of course, also, there's a big difference in the kind of workers that these two companies hired. I mean, General Motors created lots and lots of jobs for typical average people. Google, on the other hand, creates a much smaller number of jobs for really very capable people, people that have very often gone to the very best universities in the world and have very high levels of education and training and so forth. So looking forward, my point here is that eventually the whole economy could gradually come to look more like Google and less like General Motors. And that potentially could mean that there's simply less jobs out there. And also that there are less jobs that are really a good match for typical average people, and that maybe a lot of the new jobs that are being created really require lots of skill and education that might be beyond a lot of typical people in our economy. Here's another graph that also, this is also about what you might call creative destruction, but now I'm thinking in terms of occupations rather than industries. And one thing that you'll hear people say many times is that, sure, a lot of jobs that exist today might disappear because of technology, but there are going to be new jobs created, entirely new kinds of work, things that today we can't even imagine. And that is certainly true to some extent. I mean, you can already think of jobs that exist today that not too long ago we wouldn't have been able to anticipate. Things like social media marketers and data scientists and website designers, for example. These are all jobs that not too long ago people wouldn't have been able to imagine. But what I'm showing on this particular graph, if you look at the bar chart on the right side, it's showing that while these new jobs do exist, they really are not a big fraction of employment. So in the United States, for example, it turns out that about 90% of the workforce is engaged in occupations that existed 100 years ago. So, it's things like driving cars and trucks, working in factories and warehouses, working in offices, doing relatively routine work, preparing and serving food, doing these kinds of service sector jobs, working in healthcare. These are all jobs that someone in the year 1915 would have been quite familiar with. And it still is where the vast majority of our workforce is employed. And yet it's pretty clear that a lot of these traditional types of work are certainly going to be disrupted. I mean, to give one obvious example, think about self-driving cars and trucks. That alone is going to be millions and millions of jobs. And I think eventually that will happen. It might take 15 or 20 years before we really have viable self-driving vehicles having a big impact, but eventually I think it's inevitable that that will happen. And the question is, if those millions of jobs are lost in these traditional areas, are there really going to be enough entirely new things created to absorb all those workers? And again, I think there's also that skill mismatch issue, the fact that maybe there will be new things created, but maybe they won't be the kinds of jobs that are really a good match for someone that stays, for example, driving a taxi. So again, that's another thing to be a bit concerned of. So let me show you some actual economic data, and this is taken mostly from the US, but many of these trends have also been observed around the world, and I think that you can look at the US as a strong indicator of maybe what the future looks like for those countries that aren't quite as far along in this process. What you see here is a comparison of productivity and compensation for typical workers in the United States. Now, productivity is basically equal to the value of what we produce divided by the number of hours that it takes to produce it. And what you see is, if you look at the first half of these graphs, is that these two lines move together perfectly. They're perfectly correlated. And any economist will tell you that this is the way it's supposed to work. The idea is that technological progress makes the machines and the technology used in workplace get better and better. That makes the workers more effective. Those workers can then produce more. They become more efficient. And as a result, they should be able to command higher wages. And so their wages should go up in line with productivity. And that's just what happened in the United States up until the mid-1970s. But you see at that point, these two lines kind of separate. They decouple. There's a big gap now. And basically, hourly compensation for typical workers in the United States has basically stagnated. It's been flat, whereas productivity has continued to climb, and so you see this huge gap opening up. Now, one of the things that I think is really driving this and causing this to happen is that the nature of our technology is changing. If you look at that post-war period after World War II, where these two lines moved together, during that period, machines were clearly tools. They were something that workers used that made a worker better at his job and made him more valuable. But increasingly, machines are shifting to, in many cases, substitute for workers rather than complement them. In other words, in many cases, they're making workers less valuable, not more valuable, because the machine is becoming autonomous and the worker maybe isn't required at all, or maybe the job is de-skilled so that the worker is more commoditized and competing with more people. So I think that that's one of the biggest things opening up this big gap here. And you see here the small graph on the top left is for the United Kingdom, and you can see it's basically the same shape. So we're observing this basic phenomenon in many countries across the world. And I think that already this is, in both of these countries that you see here, has led to political disruption, right? I mean, many people were surprised in last November when Donald Trump was elected in the United States. Many people were surprised by Brexit. I think that to some extent, the fact that many average people feel they're being left behind by progress, and they are, because this graph shows that very radically, I think that is part of the reason we've seen this kind of political disruption, and it's something that could well get worse in the future as this trend continues to accelerate. Here's a graph showing what job creation in the United States looks like. It shows for every decade over roughly that last half century, how many new jobs has the economy created in percentage terms. And you can see it looks almost like a staircase going down. Basically, every decade has produced fewer new jobs in percentage terms than the preceding decade. So there's something going on there. You know, something is just making the economy less effective at creating new jobs. And I think that certainly the impact of technology is one of the big things that's happening, causing that to happen. Now here's another graph that looks almost the mirror image of that one. Now we have a staircase that's going upward. This is showing what happens when we have a recession in the United States. When an economic downturn happens, millions and millions of jobs are lost. Eventually, at least in number, those jobs return. So total employment gets back to the same point it was at the beginning of the recession. But it's taking longer and longer for that to happen. This graph shows how many months it's taken during recent recessions for the economy or the job market to recover. You can see it's getting, it's longer and longer. It's almost as though the job market is kind of losing its elasticity, its ability to spring back to where it was before. It's getting harder and harder to do that. And I think, again, that technology is almost certainly one of the main things driving that. The other thing that's happening here is that when we have a recession, a lot of jobs are lost, and then jobs eventually come back, but they're actually not the same jobs. It turns out that when an economic downturn happens, the first jobs to really get destroyed are the good, solid, middle-skill, middle-class jobs. In other words, jobs that pay a decent middle-class living, they have good benefits, vacation and pensions and things like that. The jobs don't require an extreme amount of education and training, somewhat. So they're accessible to most people in our population. These are the kinds of jobs that most workers aspire to, and they disappear right away when we have an economic downturn. But then we find that when things finally recover and the jobs come back, those jobs don't reappear. Instead, job creation has been weighted much more heavily toward less desirable jobs, the low-wage service sector jobs, working in retail stores or working at McDonald's, making hamburgers, these kinds of jobs. And they pay a lot less. Sometimes they're not even full-time jobs. They don't have good benefits and so forth. So this is really important effect. It's what's called polarization, or a hollowing out, or a disappearing of the middle-class jobs. And again, this is something that has been observed not just in the United States, but also in many countries in Europe as well. So it's a global phenomenon. It's something that I think demonstrates that technology is already having an impact. And even though in the United States and here in the Czech Republic we have low unemployment rates, there are other trends that are worth looking at that suggest that things can change quite rapidly. There's no guarantee that those jobs in the US and things like fast food are going to continue to be created in those numbers, because there are already many companies working on robots to automate fast food. So a lot of these trends could get a lot more severe in the future, I think. So let me talk a bit about some of the technologies that are really important here. Now, robots have been around for a long time. If you had gone into an automotive factory in an advanced country back in the 1980s, you would have already seen big, powerful industrial robots at work. And these are extraordinarily precise, powerful, fast, efficient machines. And what all that automation has meant is that in advanced countries, really all of the rote, repetitive assembly line jobs in factories have already disappeared quite a long time ago. And so the jobs in factories that have been left are those that are to some extent unpredictable. They're often jobs that rely on qualities like visual perception and dexterity. Examples might be loading and unloading trucks at a factory, or picking a part out of a bin and then feeding it into the next machine. These are things that so far machines have not been able to do, so they've been safe for workers. But that is changing quite rapidly. Robots are advancing quite rapidly. What you see here is a photograph of a robot built by a company called Industrial Perception in Silicon Valley. And it's a robot that is specifically focused on moving boxes. And you can see in the illustration that it basically looks like a robotic arm, and at the end of that arm is a machine vision camera. And this is a robot that can essentially figure out how to load and unload these boxes. And you can see in the illustration here that the boxes are not stacked precisely. Some are rotated, there are gaps between the boxes. The boxes are different shapes and sizes and colors. Some have got text on them. Up until very recently, this would have been a visual perception and dexterity challenge that only a human worker would have been able to figure out how to move these boxes. But this company has built a robot that it expects to move about one box every second. And that would compare to a box every 6 seconds for a human worker that would be doing this kind of work. So you can see that that's going to be very disruptive. And this is this is a machine that will work continuously. It's never going to get tired. It's never going to hurt its back or file a workers' compensation claim. So you can see that as this technology gets better and cheaper and more available, more reliable, that more and more companies are going to come to rely on it, and that's going to threaten a lot of jobs. In the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of people that do this kind of work and depend on that livelihood. And of course, this impact of more dexterous, precise robots is going to impact in many, many factory environments and warehouse environments throughout the world, not just in the US, but also in developing economies in China, here in the Czech Republic. I know that here you've got a very low unemployment rate, and I think there are factories here that are actually struggling to find enough workers. So it may seem very kind of nebulous, this idea that the robots are going to come along and take a lot of jobs, and yet things can change quite rapidly. You can make the same sort of point with self-driving trucks, which is something that many people think could be enormously disruptive in the future. In the United States, and I think maybe here also, there's a shortage of truck drivers. That's in part because the US is a very big country, and driving a truck across the whole country is not a very desirable job. You're away from home all the time. So even though there's a shortage now, it doesn't change the fact that once self-driving truck technology comes along, millions of jobs could disappear, and that will be very difficult on those people that do rely on those jobs. So it is important to not be too complacent, to realize that these technologies are coming rapidly, and within 10 or 20 years, it can have a very different outlook. So for these types of jobs in factories and warehouses, if you've got a job lifting a box, there's always been kind of a solution to this problem. If automation comes along and replaces that kind of work, the idea is that we should send workers back to school, give them some more training, and hopefully they'll move up that skills ladder. They'll do something more sophisticated. And that, in many cases, could be a very positive story. Maybe if you're lucky, you don't have to work lifting heavy boxes all day anymore. Maybe you end up in an office in a much more comfortable, safer work environment, doing something that uses your brain instead of your back. And that's sort of the story of how things have worked in the past. But what I want to show you now is one reason that I think maybe that particular approach is not going to be sustainable. And this is, it comes from a story that was in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago. And it's focused on white-collar automation, or in other words, automation that impacts white-collar work or knowledge work. So it's not about physical robots, it's just about software automating work. And if you look at the bar chart on the right, that is showing you the number of employees in the corporate finance department in the largest US corporations. Now, corporate finance means jobs like accounting, financial planning, accounts payable and receivable clerks, these types of work. And if you look at that graph, it shows that in a recent 10-year period, the number of workers in that department relative to the revenue of the corporation has declined by about 40% over a recent 10-year period. So nearly half of those jobs have disappeared, and it's happening because of smart software, very often what we call robotic process automation, or software that can automate more routine work. And that is something that's very likely to accelerate quite dramatically in the future. There are many examples you can give of how algorithms, and especially machine learning type algorithms, are rapidly climbing that skills ladder and taking on more sophisticated work, including work done by people that have university degrees and maybe even graduate degrees. For example, in the field of journalism, there are systems that can tap into a stream of data, determine what's really interesting or compelling about that data, and then automatically generate a news story that describes that. And you can read one of those stories and it won't be at all obvious to you that it was written by an algorithm and not by a human being. And all the biggest media companies in the United States are now utilizing these technologies to automatically generate stories. In the field of law, there have been big impacts on document review, algorithms that can review documents to find out if they're relevant to court cases. This used to be something done by lawyers and by legal assistants. There are very sophisticated systems that can analyze contracts and do a lot of the routine legal work that used to be done by lawyers. So even a lawyer, someone that's professional and very highly educated, is increasing the impact. An even more extreme example would be a radiologist. This is a medical doctor that specializes in looking at medical images, things like x-rays and mammograms, for example. To be a radiologist in the United States, you have got to go to university for 4 years, medical school for another 4 years, then at least 5 years of residency training, and then maybe even more beyond that. So it's years and years and years of advanced training to become a radiologist, a doctor. And yet, this is a job that I think at some point in the future will probably be almost entirely done by computers, because computers are already, in some cases, proving to be better than human beings at recognizing images of tumors, for example, in medical images. So it's going to be, I think, enormously disruptive, and it's really important to understand that all of this is not just about factory jobs or warehouse jobs or low-skilled jobs. It's something that is going to impact across the board and is going to impact a lot of jobs that people go to university and study for and then would like to have. So that being the case, it's something that could be very, very disruptive. And I think that we really need to start thinking about the implications of that. The other issue that I've really focused on a lot, and I think it's something very important for people to think about, is that obviously if it's at some point in the future, and again, I'm thinking, in the fairly distant future, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if a lot of jobs disappear because of technology, or maybe if a lot of jobs are de-skilled and commoditized, and people are earning less wages, that's a big social problem, of course, but it's also a big economic problem in the sense that the market economy needs consumers. You've got to have people that can buy the products and services that are being produced. I mean, that's how capitalism works. It relies on people to create the demand to buy the products, to be customers for the companies that are producing things. If you don't have enough people that really are confident and have high income, then you get into a situation where you could have stagnation, or maybe you can even have kind of a downward deflationary spiral where businesses just can't find enough customers. They can't find enough people that can buy what they're selling. And that can lead to a real economic malaise, I think. You can sort of visualize this. Think of a very rich person, a billionaire like Bill Gates. A billionaire can buy anything he wants, right? There's nothing he couldn't buy if he wanted to. And yet, even a billionaire is not going to just go out and buy and buy and buy products and services, right? A billionaire probably won't buy 1,000 cars. He's not going to buy 1,000 smartphones. He's definitely not going to go to 1,000 restaurants and eat dinner 1,000 times in one evening, right? So when you take income from 1,000 average people and instead give that all to one person, which is what happens when things become more unequal, then clearly you remove something from the economy, right? There's less consumer demand out there. And that is, something that could have big implications for the future. And in many countries throughout the world, even in the United States, we've got very low rates of economic growth. We've got interest rates around zeros. Things are already, in many ways, kind of stagnant. Some areas are seeing actual deflation in Japan and some parts of Europe, for example. So as this accelerates, it becomes a bigger, more important trend. I do think that it's something we all need to think about more. It could be a bigger and bigger problem. So finally, then, the question becomes, what could we potentially do about all of this? And there are different ways you can think of this. If you're running a business, I would say that this is an easy question. If you're running a business or managing a business, you are going to have to embrace these technologies. If you don't do that, if you get behind the curve, ignore these trends, you're going to be in big trouble at some point in the future, because one of your competitors will adopt these technologies and then you'll be left behind. And it could happen very, very rapidly. One thing we see with technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics is that there's a strong first mover advantage. So whoever gets there first and understands and begins leveraging these technologies might have a big advantage. So that's a very clear message, I think. What's more interesting to me is what should we do as a society, because I think one thing that's pretty clear is that a lot of people are likely to be left behind by this. We're going to have an income distribution problem. Many workers at some point in the future may find it really hard to find a job that provides an adequate living. And again, that may be hard to believe today here in the Czech Republic where things are going smoothly, but 20 years from now, the story could be quite different. So I do think it's important to begin thinking about that. And I think essentially we're going to have to think about a future where everyone, regardless of whether they can find a full-time, well-paying job or not, is guaranteed at least some minimal level of income so that they can survive economically and so that they can also participate in the economy as consumers and help drive demand. And so one idea that I talk about a lot is a guaranteed basic income or universal basic income. And this is an idea that's becoming quite important. Many people are beginning to think about it. There are experiments with a universal basic income going on, for example, in Finland and in the Netherlands, so some of those more Scandinavian countries and so forth. Obviously, we're not now at a point where that's feasible. I don't think that it's an idea for right now, but it is, I think, a very, very important idea for the future. And I think it's great that more people are beginning to think about this and perhaps experiment with it so that we can generate some real information and data that will allow us at some point in the future to really take this seriously and perhaps create a program on a national level if that really becomes important, if we really do run into these trends. So my purpose in coming and talking to all of you and also writing about this is to get you thinking about these trends, because I do think that the impact of technology in many ways, but in particular on employment, on our society and our economy, is going to be one of the biggest issues we probably face really across the world in the coming decades. And I think that because it's such a big challenge, it's really important to get as many people as possible thinking about this. And I hope that as all of you think about it and talk to others about it, debate it, discuss it, that from that will emerge eventually some practical solutions that will help us ensure that we can build a future where everyone at every level of our society will thrive and benefit from all the amazing technologies that I think we're going to see in the coming decades. So thank you very much.